Just going to take a few minutes to let participants come in. Okay. All right, well, let me welcome you and thank you for joining us for this webinar organized by the Union for Ethical Biotrade, UEBT, in collaboration with the ABS Capacity Development Initiative. My name is Maria Julia Oliva. I'm Deputy Director of UEBT, and I've been working on access and benefit sharing since the year 2002. So that's a long time. And lots has changed in the field of access and benefit sharing since then. But I think it's clear to all of us joining today that there's still lots to do. And the question, and that's why it's so exciting to have all of you with us today, is really where is it that we need to go on the topic of access and benefit sharing? What is our vision for ABS moving forth? And this is not an abstract question. It's a very practical question because we are in the midst of developing the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, which will really be the platform that will be the basis for international and national discussions and measures around biodiversity. One of the interesting things that I'm seeing is the level of business engagement in the process of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. However, we do see that on the particular issue of access and benefit sharing, there seems to be less business engagement. And we think this is a missed opportunity because obviously access and benefit sharing rules and principles and practices are an issue that has significant implications for the activities of companies working with biodiversity. I think the issue of access and benefit sharing is also critical because it is the issue where biodiversity and people, equity and conservation come together. And also, I think it's a missed opportunity because there's so many practical experiences and perspectives that business can bring to the table. So that's why we're super excited today to have a couple of presentations from people following the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework closely. Bianca Brasil from the CBD Secretariat and our own Valérie Normand from UEBT, and then a panel of experts with a lot of experience at the policy and practical level that can help us think through some of these issues. Also, when we get to the panel stage, we will open up the chat and ask you for your opinion on what you think ABS should look like in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And of course, you'll be able to also use the Q&A function to ask questions from the presenters and the panelists. I wanted to caution you, this is because we have a couple of webinars going on. This is not the webinar where we're going to talk about practical cases. We're going to talk about practical cases and sustainable development goals on the 14th of April. We hope you'll join us for that. This is also not the typical UEBT ABS webinar where we're going to give you legal updates and talk you through some of the latest developments in national laws and regulations on ABS. That's going to be coming up later in the year, probably around September. And in the meantime, of course, you can always contact us with questions. So that is my little introduction. Thank you again for joining. And I'm going to give the floor to Bianca Brasil. She's the program manager for business engagement at the CBD Secretariat and has been continues to be super active in really promoting business engagement in the process of the post-2020 framework. So Bianca, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Hello to all. I would like to thank the UEBT team for the kind invitation and for the opportunity to join the discussion today. As Julia mentioned, my name is Bianca Brasil. I am the program manager for business engagement with the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. I was asked today to provide some inspiration and inputs on the engagement of the private sector at large. As you all know, urgent action is needed. The 2019 IPBES Global Assessment Report provided clear evidence that nature loss is accelerating at a very scary rate, actually. So nearly 1 million species are at risk of extinction from human activities that poses a major risk for business operations worldwide. Nature loss is currently one of the main risks for economies worldwide. Recent reports released by the World Economic Forum mention that over half the world's total GDP is moderately or highly dependent on nature and its services. There is no place for business as usual. The continuous degradation of ecosystem services can significantly impact economies globally. Business sector alone has a lot to gain from, taking steps into changing their business models, avoiding risks at the same time, and also benefiting from business opportunities arising from new and emerging green economy, for example. The impact of nature loss, these impacts are becoming more and more than just projections. Science is very clear. These crises that we're seeing, they're all interconnected and they must be tackled within the next decade, what we're calling in the UN system as the decade for action. We will need collective action if we are to achieve a more sustainable path for everyone. Next slide, please. So just a few words on an overview on the role of the CBD. So the Convention on Biological Diversity is an international legally binding treaty. We currently have 196 signatory countries that we call parties. The CBD entered into force in 1992 as a result of the ECO 92 conference in Rio de Janeiro. So alongside UNFCCC and UNCCD, the Conventions for Climate Change and Combat of Desertification, we are commonly known and referred to as the Rio Conventions. Every 2 years, the CBD, and of course, exceptionally this year, all the parties of the convention meet for the Conference of the Parties, where decisions are made that will guide implementation at the local and regional levels. In 2021, the Secretariat will host the COP15 in Kunming, China, and it's now scheduled to take place in October from the 11th to the 24th. Next slide, please. So CBD is currently developing a new strategic framework to be adopted at COP15. This is what we're calling the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework that will replace the current strategic plan for biodiversity that was running between 2011 and 2020. The post-2020 framework is relevant for the economic sectors due to the potential impacts to business operations globally, ranging from regulatory requirements, incentives, subsidies, resource mobilization, just to name a few. The way it's structured right now, it includes a vision, 2050 vision, which basically says that by 2050, we will be living in harmony with nature. The post-2020 also includes a mission for 2030, because of course, for you to reach out to 2050 in harmony with nature, there are a few steps and milestones that you need to take in order to guarantee that's going to happen. The post-2020 framework also includes 4 long-term goals, 20 action-oriented targets, and a whole monitoring framework that actually includes indicators, how it's going to be monitored, how it can be implemented. And of course, throughout the next decade, many steps will be taken by the convention and parties altogether to make sure that these milestones and these targets are on track and we can actually achieve what we set out to by 2030. The post-2020 will translate into actions, policies, regulations at regional and national levels. They will have direct consequences for the business environment with potential direct and indirect impacts. Policymakers are in general experienced by focusing on the bigger picture and on policies for the country they represent. So business participation in this process is very relevant, and not only to provide for diversity, but to ensure that these policies actually take into account the economic sector's perspective. So that's really, really something that we're looking and hoping that the private sector will actually provide. The task ahead of us is very complex, and it will demand all hands on deck. I think it's worth sharing at this stage that the development of the post-2020 kicked off in early 2019 with the organization of a regional consultation workshops everywhere. We held many of those workshops, thematic consultations, online submissions, inputs, and there have been 2 open-ended working group meetings for the group that was created specifically to discuss the post-2020 framework. All of these provided opportunities for private sector engagement, non-state actors at large, but of course, we are now focusing here on the private sector itself. So the business sector in particular contributed in all those instances on different levels, of course, but it was greatly welcomed. And of course, that we can observe there is a growing trend into business getting together, partnering to promote more sustainable practices, to provide commitments, ambitious commitments for biodiversity, taking steps into transforming business practices. And this is pretty much appreciated by the Secretariat. And I think only through collective action, we'll be able to achieve something really meaningful. Next slide, please. So another thing worth mentioning is during the COP meetings, there are normally two other meetings that run in parallel. So the meetings of the parties for the Nagoya Protocol and for the Cartagena Protocol. I believe most of you are familiar with either or even both of these protocols, and decisions resulting from these meetings are also extremely relevant for the business sector, specifically the ones that work with food, cosmetics, just to name a few. But I believe that Valerie will spend some more time in this following my presentation, so I'll leave it for her. Next slide, please. So the role of business, I think, just to shine a light in here, I think it's important to say that what we're trying to discuss with the private sector and the finance sector actually is that there is a key role to be played here alongside governments and civil society. So the transformation that we need to see, it cannot be achieved only through regulation or through government actions. We need all hands in deck. It will be very, very instrumental that the society plays its role, but the economic sector also does. And the few things that we're trying to provoke the private sector is through recognizing and specifying materiality through the dependencies and impacts, actually learning what are their dependencies and impacts, measuring them, and of course reporting them for transparency. Integrating the values of biodiversity into the decision-making process across all operations and portfolios. Greening supply chains, portfolios in the case of the financial sector, increasing funding for biodiversity protection and sustainable use. And I spoke already about measuring and reporting. So all these things, they are very relevant and they are very focused and oriented by business sectors. If we can accomplish that, if we can get companies to understand that they need to understand, to assess their impacts and their dependencies on nature, they will learn more about their own businesses. They will know exactly where risks lie, where opportunities also arise. So, this is the main calling that we're doing for businesses. Next slide, please. So how can businesses engage? There are many ways in which businesses can engage. So we are calling businesses to providing inputs and contributions through the preparatory meetings, online consultations, virtual meetings, and etc. But also through major networks that they might work with. So there's a growing trend in, multi-stakeholder platforms. Business associations are becoming more and more active. And through all this work, you can see that businesses' voices are getting heard. All the tools and mechanisms that they develop, strategies that they develop, they are becoming more visible. And this is very positive because it creates a push from, the leading companies, and the other companies may follow, and that's what we're hoping to see. It is important to stress that COP will be the adoption of the post-2020 framework. And that's when countries agree on global goals, targets, and a monitoring framework. And certainly the economic sectors at large will be impacted. This is something that we all are pretty much aware. These goals and targets will guide us through the next decade and beyond, and the business sector is one of the key players. Implementation will depend actually on great extent to the support and the commitment of the private sector, and we need to work together to be able to safeguard the future. We need nature front and center in all government and business decision making. The global goals cannot be achieved without business sector constructive contribution. Business, it goes beyond legal compliance. Business can help through commitment, meaningful actions, transformation of existing practices, greening of value chains, innovative approaches, investment in research, and of course, conservation and restoration. So during COP, just to finalize here, during COP15, we are planning many activities related to business. There will be a business and biodiversity forum that will be an opportunity to showcase best practices, ambitious commitments, bring to the table what the private sector has been doing that can be positive for biodiversity. There will be a high-level segment that will bring together business representatives and ministers at the high level, country representatives. There will be an innovation and technology expo where also, good practices can be showcased, and a series of capacity building workshops that will help with knowledge sharing and prepare companies actually to the implementation process that will take the next decade. So there are many opportunities. We are hoping, through many of these streams of work, and in particularly with the work that UEBT has been doing in the landscape of ABS, we will be able to engage more and more companies. They will be more interactive, they will be more active, and they will learn about the benefits of engaging in the long term. Thank you so much for having me, and I hope you all enjoyed the event.
Thank you so much, Bianca. That was fantastic. I think you've given us a sense of really the work to put, as you say, nature front and center, and also the importance of business, not just as key to the change that needs to happen, but key to the shaping of what needs to happen. So this engagement at this time to really see what are the steps, what are the milestones, as you mentioned, to reach this vision of harmony with nature. And as I mentioned in the introduction, one of the areas where I think more discussion is really needed around this topic is the issue of access and benefit sharing. So I'm going to move directly to my colleague Valerie. We'll come back for questions for both panelists afterwards, but happy to welcome Valérie Normand. She's a senior advisor on access and benefit sharing at UEBT. She's been with us for about 1.5 years, and before that, spent many years really working within the CBD Secretariat on the topic of access and benefit sharing, and really behind the negotiation and adoption of the Nagoya Protocol. So Valerie, please take it away. Thank you.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon to all of you. Thank you, Julia, for that introduction. So building on the presentation by Bianca, I would like to dive a bit further into the post-2020 framework. And this presentation is really provides a general overview for those of you who are not familiar with the ongoing negotiations of this global biodiversity framework and how it is addressing access and benefit sharing. If we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so what you have now on the screen is basically a timeline which shows you that there are a number of meetings leading to the adoption of this post-2020 global biodiversity framework. As you know, due to the pandemic, the process was delayed, and the COP15, which was initially to be held in October of 2020, is now planned for October 2021. The negotiations are being led by two co-chairs. One is from Canada, the other is from Uganda. And the negotiations are being carried out in a negotiating body, which is essentially an open-ended working group, where all parties to the convention, so 196 governments, representatives from these governments are invited to participate in this negotiation. So there have been 2 meetings of this open-ended group so far. It is planned that there should be a 3rd meeting in August in preparation for the adoption of the framework, as I said, at COP15 in China in October. So as a basis for this negotiations, there is a draft of the post-2020 framework. There was a 0 draft, which was first prepared. Now discussions are based on an update to the 0 draft. And there should be, in the coming months, in preparation for the 3rd meeting of the negotiating body, a draft 1.0. And so basically this draft is, of course, this 0 draft, the update of the 0 draft is the current draft which is being discussed and is the basis for our discussion today. And of course, as Bianca said, although the framework is negotiated by governments, there have been a large number of meetings, consultations, and opportunities for stakeholders, including the business community, to contribute to this process. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So as Bianca was saying, the 2050 vision is about living in harmony with nature. And there are 4 long-term goals which are related to this 2050 vision. Goal A relates to ecosystems, species, and genetic diversity. Goal B is about recognizing nature's contribution to people. Goal C is the goal which relates to access and benefit sharing. And goal D is really about means of implementation. And it's important to mention here that a number of the parties to the convention that are therefore negotiating the framework have highlighted the importance for this framework to address equally in a balanced manner the 3 objectives of the convention, which are, of course, conservation, sustainable use, and benefit sharing. Next slide, please. Okay, so as again, Bianca was saying, in order to achieve this 2050 goal, the mission for 2030 is to take urgent action across society to put biodiversity on a path to recovery for the benefit of planet and people. And in order to achieve this mission for 2030, for each of the 4 goals, some milestones have been established for 2030. And the milestones which relate specifically to access and benefit sharing are that ABS mechanisms are established in all countries, and that benefits shared are increased by a certain percentage, which is still to be determined. Now, again, just to again remind you that what I'm presenting here is what is in the update to the 0 draft. So this is all still under discussion. And as parties would say, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So these are all issues under discussion. So moving now to the next slide. So in order to achieve these 2030 milestones, there are 20 action targets for 2030. These targets address or relate to reducing threats to biodiversity, meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing, and to tools and solutions for implementation and mainstreaming. All of these, of course, contributing to reducing the rate of biodiversity loss. And as part of these 20 targets, there is 1 target which relates specifically to access and benefit sharing. Next slide, please. Now here you see on this slide a number of targets which actually are relevant to ethical sourcing of ingredients. So I will mention a few of them. So for instance, there are targets which relate to recovery and conservation of wild species, sustainable harvesting, trade and use of wild species, the importance of biodiversity values in policies and planning, mainstreamed across all sectors, the importance of the participation of indigenous peoples and local communities. So just to give you some examples of targets which are of relevance to ethical sourcing. Next slide, please. So now here, again, you have a synthesis or an overview of what are the elements of the post-2020 framework, which relates specifically to ABS. So again, the 2050 goal, which is for benefits from the utilization of genetic resources to be shared fairly and equitably. The 2030 milestones, which are again that ABS mechanisms are established in all countries, and that benefits shared are increased by a certain percentage. And target 12 establishes a direct link between benefits shared and the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. So in other words, benefit sharing is to contribute to conservation and sustainable use, which is already an important element in the Nagoya Protocol. And there's an article on this in the Nagoya Protocol. Next slide, please. Now, as Bianca mentioned, an important element of this post-2020 framework is the monitoring framework. In other words, governments have recognized that it's important to agree on indicators to be able to measure progress with implementation. And so as this draft monitoring framework has been developed by the Secretariat of the CBD, based on a large number of information and sources of information and inputs from organizations and parties. And the draft framework will be discussed at a meeting to be held likely in May. Now, what you will see on the slides now are the main indicators which are being suggested to assess progress towards the 2050 goal and milestones. So basically, there are outcome related indicators. And so the main indicators for ABS are the two that you see on the screen here. To measure monetary benefits. So it would be about the amount of monetary benefits received by countries from the utilization of genetic resources as a result of an ABS agreement, including associated traditional knowledge. And to measure non-monetary benefits, it is the number of research and development results or publications shared as a result of an ABS agreement. So these are the two indicators suggested so far, the two main indicators that would help to measure progress towards the 2050 goal and 2030 milestones. And in the next slide, you have the indicators that are suggested to measure progress towards achieving the target by 2030. And these are more meant at measuring what are the steps that are needed or the actions needed to achieve the target. So they relate to, for instance, the number of access and benefit sharing permits or their equivalent granted for genetic resources. So as you know, when countries grant access to genetic resources, they are meant to grant a permit, award a permit, which then becomes an internationally recognized certificate of compliance. Another indicator is the extent to which legislative, administrative, or policy measures on access and benefit sharing measures have been adopted. And another indicator suggested is to measure the number of users that have shared benefits from the utilization of genetic resources. Additional indicators, complementary indicators are also being discussed. And as I was saying earlier, this is still a suggestion and is a basis for ongoing discussions. Now, as you can imagine, there are a number of challenges related to identifying indicators to measure access and benefit sharing. Some of these have been raised by parties and by stakeholders, such as, for instance, the fact that in many cases, the information on monetary benefits are confidential, for instance. Another challenge is the fact that it's very difficult to monitor non-monetary benefits, especially when you're talking about capacity building or the sharing of knowledge, for instance. So how do you quantitatively measure that? Or, for instance, how can you actually measure the proportion of benefits that contribute to conservation and sustainable use? So these are some of the challenges that are being discussed in agreeing on indicators related to access and benefit sharing. And if we can go to the final slide, please. So I'm almost over. So basically, just to say again that there are a number of upcoming meetings which will lead to the final adoption of the post-2020 framework in October by the Conference of the Parties. And as Bianca was saying, it's very important, although the business community and companies are not, of course, themselves negotiating this post-2020 framework, there are a number of opportunities to provide input into the process and ideas, given that, of course, users of genetic resources are key players in the implementation of access and benefit sharing, and therefore the business community. Also, just to mention one last thing, which adds to the challenge, is that, of course, access and benefit sharing, as you know, is about a change in behavior and mindset. So this is also very, very challenging to measure in terms of the impact this has in quantitative terms. So this is just to provide, again, a bit of food for thought. And now we're very happy to have some input from our panel and hopefully from participants also today in this meeting.
Great. Thank you so much, Valerie. And I hope participants really through these two excellent presentations are getting a sense of the importance of the post-2020 framework. You mentioned over 190 countries negotiating what will be the basis for all their policies, a multi-stakeholder process of consultation and input. And really the question is, what is the role in all of this for ABS? What is it that we're aiming for? And how do we even begin to monitor this? So I think this is what we're going to be discussing with the panel. But before that, I wanted to touch upon two questions coming from participants. One is around the idea of, you know that Brazil has very recently ratified the Nagoya Protocol. So I wonder if either of the speakers, the participant wonders, how does this change dynamics having Brazil on the table?
I think, you know, this was a long time coming. Brazil had a very prominent role into negotiating the whole Nagoya Protocol even before it was born back in 2010. So it's very encouraging to see that despite a bit of a delayed action now, finally they have come to the table to also now be able to negotiate some of the outcomes after a decade of the establishment of the protocol, but also with this huge responsibility that we have into turning things around for the next decade. So I think, you know, the more the better. I think Brazil has huge capacity. They have enormous companies in the country that work with ABS. They're front and center into the discussions at the national level. Specifically, if you talk about the private sector role in all this, in Brazil, I was working with a cosmetics company at the time, and I was able, it enabled me to actually observe the role the private sector has into crafting actually the biodiversity law that is now in place in Brazil as a result of the Nagoya Protocol. You know, the private sector had a leading role, and we're hoping to see that strengthening in time with their adoption.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bianca. Yeah, I think that the importance of business engagement on biodiversity and ABS policies, I think in Brazil, the experience is definitely very positive. I want to touch upon another question, maybe Valerie, for you. Several of the participants are asking, I'm looking at a question by Pierre Johnson and Cédric Dufoucault on this link between conservation and human well-being. Sustainable use, livelihoods, this connection of people and biodiversity. Could you, Valerie or Bianca, talk a little bit about how this comes together in the context of the post-2020 framework, or we are hoping it will come together?
I think we're hoping it will come together, but there were a few safeguards that parties wanted to include in the whole negotiation process, and within the zero draft itself, to make sure that this is everybody's framework. It's not just a framework for governments to discuss, but everyone will have a role to play. One of the discussions that is ongoing is on the mainstreaming, for example. Let me just talk about that specifically. So there is a long-term strategic approach on mainstreaming being discussed right now. This is derived from the need to know more and to explore how we can actually mainstream biodiversity into all decision-making processes, governments, civil society, economic sector, and all that. So in all these steps, we always took the careful consideration into how to include the role of society, communities, indigenous peoples, because it won't make sense otherwise. If it's a country-only discussion, we are risking to have what we have now. If you look at the global biodiversity outlook that was launched a couple of months ago, it became very clear that we failed into achieving many of the 8 biodiversity targets. And I think that is greatly to do with the fact that we didn't engage enough of the other interested parties and stakeholders. So I think now we are in the right path, the right direction, and we need to engage more and more.
Right. I think that the mainstreaming part is actually a key part of all of these other discussions. So you're absolutely right, Bianca, to bring it in. Valerie, wondering if you could just emphasize this link between people and biodiversity, also in the context of ABS, but also something that Mary is bringing to the table, and is this idea that you and I often talk about how ABS should not be about compliance, but a change in paradigm. So maybe if you could just say a couple of words about that.
Yes, thank you, Julia. No, indeed. I mean, of course, as we know, access and benefit sharing involves a change in behavior between users and providers of genetic resources. And the providers of genetic resources are, as we know, often indigenous peoples and local communities. And the role they play in conserving and sustainably using biodiversity is key. And therefore, there is also a key role to be played in the negotiations of the framework by indigenous peoples and local communities. And they are actively involved in the process, as they have been in CBD processes over many years. So they are definitely a key actor in implementation. So when we talk about sourcing with respect for people and biodiversity, this is certainly the case in the context of these negotiations of this framework.
Right, and we'll explore this also further in the panel. We have a couple of interesting questions still left, but I'm going to hold on to those and maybe put them also to the panelists. So with this, I'd really, again, just like to thank both of you for the great presentations and really explaining this. I've tried to read all the details of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. It's complicated, so thank you so much for making it that much simpler. But yeah, now I'm going to ask our panelists to join us and really have a discussion. We have a great panel, people with a lot of experience, as I mentioned, at the policy and really at the practical level. So Ulrich, Stephanie, Pierre, Matthias, and Daphne, I'm going to ask you to turn on your cameras. And as you do that, we're also going to open up the chat where we're hoping participants can also answer this question that we're posing to the panelists today. What is the vision for ABS, and what can a meaningful ABS system contribute to conservation, sustainable use, local livelihoods, and how do we monitor this? How do we measure it? So thank you all so much for joining us today. And I'm going to start the discussion with maybe you, Pierre. You've been working on these issues even longer than me. And I know that one of the points that Valerie raised is this point that the post-2020 framework needs to incorporate the 3 objectives of the CBD, and this emphasis on sometimes an objective seen to be a little forgotten, which is this issue of fair and equitable benefit sharing. So I'm wondering if you can a little bit make the case for why ABS is such a key element in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework in your perspective.
A trick question to start, right? Well, I think it's really important that people bear in mind that the CBD is not primarily a nature conservation treaty, that it's a sustainable development treaty, that it's about finding ways of living in the world that lead to conservation of biodiversity. And for that reason, I think the most promising thing that comes with the discussions around the framework is this idea that we're trying to effect a transformative change. That we're not doing business as usual. We're trying to find a way that would really make a difference, because this is probably the last decade we have to really seriously make a difference on conserving biodiversity. And for that reason, what I'm thinking is that what you really need to do is you need to understand that benefit sharing is the incentive for sustainable use, and sustainable use is really the only way that we know to achieve conservation. So benefit sharing is not an afterthought, it's not something that comes later when you have the luxury of doing it. It is something that you really have to put up front and bring about that transformative change. And also, as Valerie mentioned, the transformative change in how people relate to that. Because the way that ABS has been implemented so far is basically created all sorts of incentives and then created avenues for bypassing benefit sharing. Right? There's many places where you can get genetic resources with no benefit sharing obligation. And okay, yes, there are ethical biotraders, thank goodness for them, right? I mean, and they are doing the right thing. But really what you need is you need to put in place a system that will recognize and reward and crucially resource the indigenous people and local communities that live with biodiversity day to day and make those day-to-day decisions that conserve biodiversity or destroy it. You have to find a way of incentivizing the conservation and countering the destruction.
I really liked Pierre in a presentation I recently saw you give, is kind of turning around the CBD objectives. Instead of conservation, sustainable use, and benefit sharing, sustainable use and conservation, which is a little bit what you're saying now. So thank you. I think that's a very good way to get us started. I'm going to jump to you, Stephanie. You work with Firmenich, which is a company that now has specific targets on compliance with Nagoya Protocol as part of your ESG ambitions. So I'm just wondering, you've always thought about this in the context of your company. What about more broadly? What would be your vision, or from your experience, the vision for ABS in the post-2020 framework?
Hi, Julia. Hi, everyone. Thanks for welcoming me in the panel. So definitely, I mean, what we were saying about the wheel that you just mentioned about, Pierre, this is exactly that. I mean, the third objective of the CBD was to create that incentive, that virtuous cycle of creating that opportunity for sustainable use. And then actually, as you were saying, Pierre, it's great to turn this around to achieve the conservation objectives as well. So as a company, putting forward our ambition to reach and to implement the ABS principles as they are framed by the Nagoya Protocol and as they are framed by the national regulations, help us to create a big engagement internally in our company, because you cannot work on this alone. You need to engage, to create awareness on all of these. And as a company, it's also linked to our ambition by 2050 to positively contribute to biodiversity. It's one of the means for us as a company to reach that objective, but it's to reach it together. And we have concrete cases where you need strong partnership. And I know that most of us around the table, Pierre and Ulrich mainly, where you sit in Africa, I mean, all is around partnership. You cannot do it alone. And yes, indeed, conservation is one of the key objectives that you could reach on that. And you can frame non-monetary benefits around conservation if it's one of your company objective or it's one of the community objective as well. Because when you work through ABS approaches, you need to listen about the community needs, because what you want to is to respond to their needs while ensuring that they have that biodiversity awareness. So it's not only creating plantation because they need an income, but also accompanying them as a community to understand the importance of valorizing and promoting their biodiversity. So sustainable use and conservation, yeah, more or less, this is what I can say.
Great. No, this is I like this term partnership, which is something that I think we all see and agree with. And I guess what is interesting is to think about how to promote this, right? How do we lead this? But let me jump to, you mentioned Ulrich, of course, from Parceval, who Ulrich, you have so much experience on these issues, really on the ground in South Africa. I think some better than others, but a lot of also very, very good experiences on this topic. I'm wondering what, given these experiences, what do you think is the difference that ABS, that a meaningful practical system on ABS can make on the ground? Is it a tool that can make a difference if we get it right?
Thank you. Yes, I think your last statement, if we get it right, is the key here. If we see it as a tick box that needs to be just ticked off and be complied to as quickly as possible, as painlessly as possible, it can actually be sort of, I don't want to say backfiring, but it doesn't achieve what it can. I have been in a number of cases, been involved very deep on the floor, sourcing in rural areas personally and engaging in benefit sharing agreements in many cases. And initially one has the experience that it is a painful experience, because one gets thrown into an arena as running a business that we don't know about. There are often cultural hurdles in South Africa. We have economic hurdles from rural, people who have limited access to resources, to education, to infrastructure. To bridge all these hurdles is quite a challenge. And initially, one also thinks as industry, this is not really our job. I mean, our job in industry is to create jobs, to create products, to make profit, to pay taxes, and go home and enjoy the weekend, and leave the implementation of development of people to the government, or better trained people. However, it is also quite refreshing if one really takes the approach of engaging with people and involving oneself on that deep level in the communities. It does create the bridges. And we as a company, we see one of our important missions also is to build those bridges from business to these communities, but also from a business like ours, which is relatively small, to a company like Firmenich, where Stephanie is working, and also build a bridge to government. In our case, we're working a lot with our Department of Environment, and trying to implement the ideas, the acts and regulations, and make possible what the spirit of the Nagoya Protocol set out to achieve. And it's that putting oneself in the middle between all these processes. I feel very strongly as a company we are at the coal face. We're wrangling with regulators. We're trying to make people and our customers understand that, you know, if you sit in Europe in a nice office, this is how far away that is from a reality in Africa or Madagascar or elsewhere. It's those bridging that, bringing it together. That for me is certainly very, very important. And without ABS, to be quite honest, although it's hard work, it's difficult, it's cumbersome, it's painful at times. Without ABS, the Nagoya Protocol in place, I probably wouldn't have engaged at the same level. So I think there is a place to pull people into that and bring them closer together.
Yeah. Okay, so so ABS definitely has a role in it. You know, it is in building these bridges. It's in generating these partnerships and these relationships. Okay. Another point you raised, and of course we could have a whole other webinar about the role of business, you know, and what is the ultimate goal of business. I think there's a lot of economic and philosophical discussions about that. But I think obviously businesses are out to create value, right? And create value through research and product development. And I think, Daphne, going to you from the work of ICC, I remember you issued a document a while back on perspectives on ABS, and a lot of it I think was around this idea of value creation. How do we make sure that an ABS system, a vision for ABS, promotes also this aspect of R&D? So I'm just wondering, looking at the post-2020 framework, how do you see that? How do you see that coming together? How does that all play out in the context of this document or process?
Yeah, well, thanks, Julia. Thanks for inviting me to speak at this. Yeah, I think I'd like to come back maybe a little bit. You asked about the vision, and we talked about the goals, and Pierre talked about transformative change, and also the interesting that CBD goals are more sustainable development. And I think that ABS can act as a bridge between like goal A of protection of the environment, of the biodiversity, and goal B of human needs, which I think goes to the point of sustainable development. And the second pillar of the CBD, sustainable use, is a way of using biodiversity to serve human needs, but in a way that doesn't impact biodiversity. And if the ABS system can help promote that, I think that would really be very meaningful and help fulfill like both goals of the CBD. And see, I think Pierre has talked about one of the original aims of the ABS system, which was really to encourage local communities, which are the custodians of genetic resources, to give them an alternative means of livelihood and incentive to preserve biodiversity. What has happened over the years is that very specific goal seems to have become a bit much enlarged, and there doesn't seem to be a really clear common goal anymore. And as a result, the ABS legislations around the world have started impacting R&D in contexts that are very far removed from the ground, that for instance Ulrich and Stephanie are used to, because they're actually contacting people on the ground. And the system may not really be adapted for that kind of context. And as a result, what we have experienced, I mean, our member companies have experienced, is that the way ABS is implemented today is actually having quite a negative impact and discouraging research innovation that could actually yield quite a lot of value for conservation, for health, agriculture, for all kinds of human needs, really.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. How do you, I'll ask you a follow-up question. what are ways in which we could look at ABS in the context of a framework? So, I mean, we don't need to look at the details of laws, but how could this, in your view, improve? How could we then make sure that the incentives are there to engage? What would that look like? I mean, you can say something at a very general level. I'm not asking you for a solution.
Yeah, well, I think that for systems to work, you need to align, you need to have a common goal that everyone can buy into and understand. I think the context of ABS, first of all, it's got to be a goal that can resonate into companies' sustainability and corporate responsibility goals. For instance, I mean, I think Stephanie's company seems to have very successfully done that, but I think for a lot of companies, ABS is sort of seen as a compliance issue. Yeah. Because, you know, that's where it sort of hits people operationally generally. So I think that's one thing. Secondly, I think that you have to sort of align common interests. You know, everybody has an interest in making sure that genetic resources yield real value. They have an interest in making sure the system, it's not more costly than it's actually yielding benefits. Mm-hmm. So if you find a system that's really efficient and aligns interests and in a way can resonate and which is simple to comply with, so that, you know, it will be people are not discouraged in going through the whole process, I think that will already go a very long way.
Okay. All right. I think a couple of important points you're making, but I'll hang on to this idea of a common goal, because I think this is really where we're talking at a framework level, that we need to then make sure that the goal there that is set, whether we call it targets, however the technical term is, needs to be something that then everybody can buy into. Matthias, I wanted to come to you from IFRA. I know in many of I think in maybe all of the discussions around ABS, one of the words that comes up is complex, right? And I think we are getting that the complexity is a key part of this ABS topic. And I wondered, when you think about kind of a vision for ABS, is there a way to capture this complexity rather, you know, in a positive way, rather than just despair that it is so complex? How will we do it? What do you think?
Oh, wow, that's an excellent question. And thanks for having me here, Julia. And I think we're presenting a trade sector that actually covers or picks up nearly every aspect that has already been mentioned here. And certainly what we are facing is how to address various aspects of complexity in the whole thing. And in that perspective, our role has been raising awareness, explaining to our members the complexity of the regulation, helping them to comply. So that's one aspect of complexity. I think the other aspect, a very important one, which we are tackling more recently, is also to make all the stakeholders and the partners in getting into ABS agreements understand the complexity of supply chains. And I think, unfortunately, our sector, the fragrance and flavor sector, I'm not only talking for fragrance, also for flavor, is a very good, bad example, because we are an in-between industry. So we source naturals from various sources, and then we manufacture mixtures, and then we sell these mixtures to end producers. So this complexity of supply chains, I think, is adamant to be understood and reflected in ABS systems, because otherwise really we have a problem of implementation and compliance. So helping to understand that complexity, I think that's a very important role that we can take. And in that context, another thought comes to my mind, what we haven't talked about yet, but we have so many different participants and stakeholders in these discussions. And what we have identified is there's sometimes a problem of using the same language, using the same terminology, or we use terminology that the indigenous communities might not understand, might not be familiar with. So if we are not at the beginning be able to come to using a same language, or at least come to an agreement what we talk about, that's also an element of complexity and hindrance in coming to good and workable solutions.
Yeah. And I think there, us lawyers have to take a little bit the blame for the language difficulties, because we could, of course, have a huge debate about what we mean by genetic resource. There's a definition, but we could, of course, still have a very long debate about what's covered. So I think the issue of language you raise is very important indeed. Stephanie, you wanted to come in here.
I wanted to build on what I think we all agree on, that on how we can simplify the messages. So one aspect that you mentioned, Matthias, indeed, it's great to have still the space of dialogue in order to explain what is a value chain and to find out this common terminology. But as well, from what you were saying, Daphne, on as a company, in order to really go beyond compliance and only ticking the box, which is not what we are aiming at. We don't want only to tick the box. We want to go beyond, because we want this mechanism to actually be as it was planned. So meaning ensuring sustainable use and conservation. And for that, we need to have easy to navigate rules, not necessarily to easily getting the compliance, but to easily understand that. So it's always also the mention of simplifying the messages and having clear processes and rules toward that. So I wanted to build on this because I think it's really a key element of how business can be more and more engaged towards ABS principles as well.
A question maybe to anyone in the panel that wants to pick it up. I like this idea of, is it just about compliance? No, it's not just about compliance. It's not just about ticking the boxes. And I think we can all be accused of sometimes ticking the boxes, from the public sector side, ABS policymakers, to businesses trying to deal with ABS. And I guess the challenge is not to just tick the boxes. Anybody have thoughts about how we might move beyond ticking the boxes, whether it's how government should be looking at this, how businesses should be looking at this, anybody else should be looking at this? Any thoughts there? Pierre, go ahead.
Yeah, I have some thoughts on that. I mean, I think one of the problems, and I completely understand the frustrations of users of genetic resources, that ABS creates all these complexities in access, right? But it's really important that we understand that the reason that happens is because when you have a hammer, the whole world, all you have is a hammer, the world looks like a nail, right? And so for governments with biodiversity and not much in the line of economy, controlling access and negotiating a good agreement is actually the only way of securing benefit sharing on that biodiversity. And the same thing applies to at a community level. Right. And so, I mean, one of the things that I think we can really do in the context of this transformative change is to stop thinking of benefit sharing as something that you will only do under a very limited set of circumstances at the lowest percentage that your clever lawyers could negotiate when they were negotiating with non-lawyers. and say, look, this is an important part of conserving life on the only planet that we know has life. It's our home, right? And we have a collective duty as the international community to address the $700 billion a year funding gap between what we currently spend on conserving biodiversity and what the science tells us we need to spend. And business has an important role to play in that, right? I mean, business is where the money is. I keep telling my colleagues in Africa, you looking to developed countries to give you the money. They don't have the money. The money is not in their fiscus. They spend it all on vaccines this year, and the year before that they spend it on something else, right? The money's with the business community. And so if you were to turn that around, if you were to say, look, we are users, and we are all users of of genetic resources, because genetic resources is that translation between the immaterial world and the living world. So if you eat, you are a user of genetic resources. Right? If you use cosmetics, of course, you're a user of the genetic resources. But to really kind of rally around the idea that if you benefit from nature, you have an obligation to contribute to safeguarding nature, and come up with something really simple. Give 1% of your turnover to a global fund to protect nature, and then you can have free access to everything. We would never have to do a permit application ever again.
Well, I think it's very interesting. I think they have something like that called the lion's share for some other, I think, for using imagery of nature.
Yeah, but it's a tiny percentage of the advertising budget of companies that use
okay?
the biodiversity in the advertising. It's an interesting initiative, but it doesn't actually touch science in terms of funding and resource mobilization needs.
Yeah, but let me tell, I mean, so clearly, I think the issue of benefit sharing, and the interesting thing for me is that the issue of benefit sharing is really much broader than ABS. And maybe for me, this is just my personal view, sometimes we kind of mix the benefit sharing and ABS specifically discussion, and sometimes we can get a little bit into trouble there. But I think it's very important, and I think obviously from a UEBT perspective, the benefit sharing aspect, the social aspect, the equity aspect is key. We cannot just be looking at the issue of nature and protecting nature if we don't look at that aspect. So fully agree with you there. But I want to touch base on this idea of the monetary benefits, which you've mentioned. And a couple of people have asked about how does this work if you have to pay percentages and report on money spent. Is this counterproductive? How can we make sure that it goes to conservation? These are some of the questions being posed by participants. And I just wanted to raise, because obviously one of the things that happens in the framework is this monetary framework, right? How do we measure it? And one of the big ideas at this point is to measure monetary benefits, which seem, in line with some of the points that are being raised by Pierre and others, yet at the same time seems to differ from this idea of change in paradigm, building bridges, relationships. But of course, how do we measure relationships? So any thoughts about monitoring, right? How can we, Bianca, I think mentioned it, of course, in the context of post-2020 framework, we want to make sure that we're able to check whether we move forward on targets. But how can we do that? How can we actually find indicators for these issues? Any thoughts about factors to consider or limitations of the monetary aspect or other ideas? Anybody want to jump in here? Ulrich, Matthias, you've unmuted. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not having the solution. I will just add. I will just add to the question, because I think it's all about the value in the end, and the value is definitely more than just a monetary value. And to measure that is exactly, I don't have the answer, but I think if we can achieve a change in the values in the industries and making the access and benefit sharing a part, and I think Pierre said it nicely, that shouldn't be seen as a threat, that should be seen as an opportunity, a normal part of the business operation. But to get there, you need to change the mindsets along the supply chains and the understanding and the contribution of this ABS, so the benefit sharing to the conservation of the nature. And that has long-term perspectives, which are in the benefit for the industry, because we all want to use natural materials in the future. I mean, our sector, fragrance and flavor, we very much depend on naturals. And they are threatened from various aspects, but our business models live from using naturals, not only tomorrow and the day after, in a long-term perspective. So everything in principle should become natural in a way that we want to contribute to the preservation, and that will have to happen via benefit sharing. Forget about all the complexities we were talking about, but I think changing this mindset in the supply chains and making ABS a kind of the value proposition. Again, I don't know how to measure that, but I think that's where I would see the goal and the future to go, so that we don't even discuss whether or not it's necessary and how it should happen best. It should be part of the understanding of the business models.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really this change in paradigm. It's also a change in business model. Ulrich, please, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, thank you. I think there are cases and there are cases, and each case is different from the other one. We have we see in South Africa often that benefit sharing agreements are reduced to monetary discussions, and then a certain percentage of whatever the case is paid into our bioprospecting trust fund and then dispersed to community. And then from then onwards, we as industry, we lose track of what actually happens to these monies. I think there are, however, also other possibilities, and I speak out of direct experience where in one quite a substantial resource, we have chosen to go a different route. And that sort of evolved. It wasn't sort of a long thought out concept, but where we actually, the monetary benefit to a traditional council that we then work with is relatively modest, but we have chosen to get involved on a direct level in the communities. And together with our client, they have a foundation, Parceval has got a foundation. So there's money channeled through those foundations into community development. And it goes around creches, it goes around teacher enrichment, etc. And those are things that are very difficult to measure, because measuring always implies also counting 1, 2, 3 schools, so much money, so many children have benefited, so many teachers have benefited. So they, and to get away from
Ulrich, I think yeah, I think your connections are getting a bit wobbly, or it's either yours or mine.
That's mine.
Okay. Okay. I'm gonna jump to Daphne, who also wanted to say something there, but I think your main points came through, Ulrich. Sorry about the connection problem. Daphne, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. Yeah, I just want to talk about maybe another aspect of the non-monetary benefit sharing, since you raised that. I think ABS, we talk a lot about utilization, which is essentially research and development and synthetic production, use of genetic resources in that respect. And I think it's very often overlooked the kinds of the value that comes from research and development, not just in necessarily the final technologies, though often that does create a lot of value for society, but also in the whole process. You know, research and development leads to are based very much on collaboration and knowledge sharing around the world between public sector and private sector. And I think the danger is that if we focus too much on very much controlling the monetary benefit sharing and have a very restrictive approach, that you're going to lose out on a lot of opportunities from the research side. So I think if you think of any transforming system, we think, you know, we talk about paradigm shift and change in mindset in approaching the system. I think that is something very important to be taken into account, and that the system has to really deliver value in the very broad sense, not just the monetary sense, but value, you know, overall for society, for human needs, for communities, just in looking at a much broader way than just monetary benefits.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm hearing from several of you is that money doesn't quite begin to count as a measure for benefit sharing, but it is clearly, I think, challenging, and none of us have the answer or an easy answer for how do we measure these broader changes that need to happen.
Can I just say something quickly about that? I mean, I agree with that. I think that there's a real need to look at how do you create value for society, but also how do you create value for the environment, right? I mean, who is to resource the looking after the environment? And, you know, it is, I mean, one of the problems we face at the moment is that we only look at the monetary aspect in valuing value, right? I mean, quarterly reports and shareholder value drives the financial world and ultimately drives the vast majority of businesses. You know, there's a lot of public investment that goes into creating that value, and then there's a lot of private extraction of that value. And that's kind of that's the root problem. I mean, isn't it? It's that we're not creating enough sustainable, regenerative, you know, growing value, which actually increases the size of the economic and the ecological pie for everyone in the world, so that we can uplift people and meet the sustainable development goals. So I do agree that value creation should be looked at, but then once you created that value, we also need to talk about how you allocate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think what is interesting also, just looking at some of the questions coming in from participants, they're raising a lot of other issues that somehow also need to be taken into account. So Bastien Beaufort, for instance, is raising the issue of fair trade, I guess, which I would, make more broadly to fair supply chains. There's various people talking about good practices leading to biodiversity conservation, sustainable use, organic agriculture, regenerative practices. People raising the role of biotechnology, synthetic biology. How does this change? How do these technological developments also change some of our considerations there? Stephanie, you have an answer for all of this.
Definitely, you know. No, but what I think is of interest for discussion is that definitely from what all we were saying is that we are not promoting the monetary benefit sharing. Definitely, for many reasons, and one of them is that, as you were saying, we lack, okay, we lose control. I mean, we give the fund and then what? How can we ensure that it goes where we want it to go? How do we ensure that this goes towards objective 1 and 2? So we as a user, as a business community impacted by such regulation or such principles, when you go beyond compliance, that we want to be more proactive in that. So going towards non-monetary benefits. And when you go towards non-monetary benefits and you implement that space of dialogue with your partners, so be they the authority or the local communities, creating, I hear you, the cross-cultural dialogue, and we all agree on that, of having that cross-cultural dialogue, then you can try to go towards actions that would meet conservation topics, or that would look into a fair trade or fair supply chain. I mean, it's up to the project, because this would be rolled out as a project. So if it's one of the components that is foreseen as the most relevant by the stakeholders of the project, then you can go toward that. So non-monetary benefits would have a major, let's say, contribution to such practices, I would say. A way to measure to what extent these kind of projects are actually contributing to the other targets of the post-2020 framework would be to look into that impact monitoring. So one of the tools we all are hearing about could be the methodologies that are being discussed through the science-based target for nature, because they are looking on the materiality of companies in terms of biodiversity. And you have many methodologies that are under study, and one of them is as well a tool from UEBT, which is the Biodiversity Action Plan. And these kind of tools could help to monitor the project to ensure that it meets the component of the project in terms of outcomes, but as well in terms of changes of practices in the ground. Then you can measure the effective change or not. I mean, because your project can be a success or not necessarily that successful. So, I mean, closing the gap, when you go towards a non-monetary benefit, you can link it to your value chain, but you are not obliged to. And for example, the Brazilian regulation for the non-monetary benefit, and if you look at the project framework, is very clear on how you can bring this forward. And you don't have to build it around your value chain, but you can. And this for businesses makes a lot of sense, because you keep growing the value creation that you were referring at, Pierre. So one aspect of that. And the other aspect that I wanted to raise as well, or to share a thought, is that, going to your point, Daphne, is that research for our stakeholders, be they the authority or other civil society, research are also framed to preserve biodiversity. When we do biodiversity-based innovation, it's not that we want to kill biodiversity. It's not that we want to do biopiracy. I mean, yes, you had cases, but definitely, I think a lot of actors have changed their mindset here, even though, well, maybe not all of them, but what I want to say here is that, at least at Firmenich, when we look into research or when we look into biotechnology, is to contribute to reducing the pressure on threatened species, not to completely forget about the natural value chain, but to provide an alternative. So because as you were saying, Matthias, the increase of natural ingredient is there. Okay, the market demand is only growing. So we need to provide alternatives to balance that pressure on resources. And one of the tools is research, and you cannot undermine that. But good research done with good principles, with a good mindset. And we need to continue creating that awareness and that supporting the change of these institutions to make sure that they meet these kind of principles.
Yeah. Well, you've managed to touch upon a number of very important issues, awareness raising, and also, and I want to kind of come back to this idea of impact. And this was the point, Pierre, that you were making at the beginning. We need to get it right. There's no option. We're running out of planet here. So having a system that works and that deals with the very real crisis that we're facing, I think is very important. Of course, there's a number of different topics that we didn't touch upon in this webinar being discussed in the context of the next Conference of the Parties, discussions around a multilateral approach to benefit sharing, which we'll probably talk about in an upcoming webinar, the issue of digital sequence information. So there's a number of different bits and pieces that fit into this. But I think what is very interesting, what I really would like to thank all the panelists is to think about this idea of the goal. As Daphne said, what is the common goal? Can we come to a common goal that we're all working towards, and that it really isn't just about, going through the motions, complying with the minimum, but really, as you're saying, Stephanie, doing it from the right place, understanding that this is just the way that we need to work in our world right now. So I think this really came across, and this will be, I'm sure, one of many discussions that we hold in preparing for the meeting of the parties of the CBD and contributing some ideas to the development of the post-2020 framework. And to just try to round it all off, I'm going to invite Suel Al-Janabi, who's the co-manager of the AB. So thank you very much to the panelists, and I'm going to ask Suel to try to summarize this really rich discussion and maybe think about some next steps. Suel, please.
Yeah, yes, I don't know whether you can hear me. I'm trying to.
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, and the host has stopped my camera. Okay, now I can. You can see me, and I hope that. Yeah. So thanks a lot for providing me that opportunity to give it a try to sum up what came out of this very, very rich discussion. I have 4 pages of notes, and I'm trying to condense it a little bit. First of all, I think it was quite important from Bianca to outline the opportunities for business to exchange at which different levels, and then from Valerie in particular pinpointing at the topics that are of specific interest in relation to access and benefit sharing, the discussion on the goals, the targets, and in particular the indicators. And there was, of course, also some reflection on the indicators now in the chat. So it's good to see business engaging with all the practical experiences, and I think it's worthwhile also to maintain that momentum, and maybe also to create something like a community of practice or practitioners that could feed then from a business perspective into the discussions of the CBD, and I will get to that in a moment. The 3 objectives of the CBD, they have been mentioned, but I think what is important is that we have to see also that we are currently just entering the so-called decade of ecosystem restoration. So what does that mean? That means that we do have a loss in biodiversity. It is decreasing, and that business as usual from business and from other stakeholders cannot be pursued. And in that regard also, only to to maintain or to invest in sustainable use is not enough. No harm is not enough. There is a need to invest into biodiversity increasing, and this I think the second goal of the convention cannot attain. For that, we really have to look into the third objective, which is then this benefit sharing for the conservation of nature and, let's say, positive biodiversity impacts. Words that have been floating were transformative change and to go beyond compliance. I think this is absolutely necessary, so that we need to see action and impact on the ground. And that this cannot only be attained with monetary benefits. Matthias put it nicely. There is more value than just in money, and that there are also, of course, non-monetary benefits that are quite important. Research and development results, for example, that can be shared. But often here, of course, there is then the IP hurdle that then refrain also of sharing these results with the users. And then, of course, non-monetary benefits are not necessarily non-financial benefits. There was a remark that we all have to speak the same language and the same use the same terminology. And here we see from experience that if we talk about these non-monetary benefits, they are not at no costs, and they are investments at the end of the users. And this is often, of course, not really understood by the providers that are receiving then the benefits, because this also has to be factored into the calculations of the users. What I also think is important, that it's not only a burden. We heard that it's a burden, but from Uli, he said, okay, it's tedious, but it's also refreshing. So we may all refresh now ourselves with and looking into how this ABS concept in the post-2020 framework can be then crafted in, as we heard, in an efficient manner, in a simple manner, to reduce complexity. And I think it was also important that we heard that complexity is to be seen from both angles. Of course, industry sees ABS systems as complex, which they are. They are very different, although they are all, I believe, to some extent following the same goals. But at the same time, of course, for regulators, the different value chains, sectors, we heard that from Matthias, are also very, very complex. And so maybe here some more understanding and also some facilitation is necessary from both ends, and then by entities like UEBT and the ABS initiative. So what I really like about this dialogue is that we, I think, on a way of convergence, of getting our heads together. We heard the words building bridges, we heard partnerships, missing links, working together. And I would like to pick up on that. You may know that there was a call for views by the CBD Secretariat on the post-2020 framework, and also on ABS, but there was little reflection from ICC, yes, but not that much from particular stakeholder business groups on how to deal with ABS. So there's still some time to go to COP, and I think it's also now time maybe to form kind of community of practice by businesses with UEBT, with us, the ABS initiative, to really look at what's workable, what can provide impact, in particular from business business angle, and also what is measurable. Because I think maybe in some 2030, if we then look back and see, okay, what has been decided in 2020 was not measurable, and we again have no impact to show, which is measurable, then the concept of ABS, to which you all subscribe, and we heard that today again, will be probably a very, very weak one. So these are some of the concluding remarks that I would like to share with you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Suel. I think you did a great job bringing all these different views together, but certainly this is not the end of this discussion. And yes, let's absolutely work together and also with the panelists, the speakers, the participants to try to develop some of these ideas forward to make sure that the post-2020 global biodiversity framework really is the vision, the targets, the indicators that we need to move forward really for meaningful transformative change. So we have, so that's definitely something that we'll be following up with on. But we do have on the 14th of April another webinar, this one focusing on specific cases that show how ABS can contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals. This is something that we're organizing jointly with GeoMedia, IBN, the Secretariat of the CBD, and the German Federal Agency for Nature Conservation. So make sure you sign up for that. We will be making the recording available of this webinar and also the presentations in PDF. And if you have any further questions, you can always reach us at abs@uebt.org. So with that, it's almost 20 degrees in the Netherlands. This doesn't happen very frequently in spring. So I'm going to go for a walk. But before I do that, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. And please do stay involved. We want to continue engaging with you and contributing to these important discussions. Thank you very much.